Before tonight's journey begins, let me know where you're listening from. Now, settle in, let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight we travel to the Firth of Clyde in September of 1909, to the pier at Ardrossan, on a salt-scoured evening when the gulls have fallen still and the only light is the honey-colored glow of a single gas lamp at the ticket office. Among them is Eleanor Underwood, a 42-year-old botanical illustrator, carrying one leather-bound sketchbook, one tin of watercolor pencils, and a grief that has kept her awake for 311 nights. She expects only a quiet crossing to the island where she spent her childhood summers, but the steamer that waits for her carries a passenger she has not seen in 20 years, and the gentle rocking of the hull will begin what no amount of counting could achieve. This is the story of Eleanor and of one September night when a woman who had forgotten how to rest discovers that the tide does not ask permission to turn. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the Glen Sannox carry you through harbor lamps and sleep. The clock on the mantelpiece in her Edinburgh flat had struck 3:30 in the morning for the 311th time, and Eleanor Underwood had been awake for every chime. She knew the exact tone of each hour because she had memorized them in the way one memorizes the voice of an unwelcome visitor who arrives at the same door every night. 3 o'clock was a thin, silvery note, like a spoon tapped against a crystal glass that had been left too long in a cupboard. 4 o'clock was duller, the sound of a bell that had grown tired of its own duty. By 5 o'clock, the note had a gray quality, as though the clock itself was weary of the dark and wished the dawn would hurry. She had tried everything that the medical manuals and the sympathetic whispers of her married friends had suggested. She had drunk warm milk, infused with nutmeg and honey. She had placed a hot water bottle against the small of her back. She had read the dullest passages of Mr. Ruskin's Stones of Venice, until the sentences blurred into a brown fog. She had counted sheep, counted breaths, counted the seconds between the gasps of the street lamp outside her window. Nothing had worked. The bed remained a place of vigilance rather than surrender, and her mind remained a restless machine that would not power down. On the morning of September the 12th, she had sat at her writing desk, a small mahogany affair inherited from her mother, with a surface scarred by ink spills and the pressure of 1,000 pressed flowers, and she had written a single sentence in her diary. "I have forgotten how to sleep. I think I may have forgotten how to be still." The words had stared back at her with the flat honesty of things that cannot be unsaid. She had closed the diary, wrapped its leather cover with a piece of green ribbon, and placed it in the bottom drawer of the desk, where she kept the pressed ferns and the dried sea holly that she had collected on the beach at Brodick when she was 12 years old. She had not opened that drawer in 20 years, and the sight of the sea holly, still prickly, still pale, still holding the ghost of the salt air, had made her chest ache with a feeling she could not name. It was her housekeeper, Mrs. McBride, who had finally broken the spell of indecision. Mrs. McBride was a woman of 57 with hands that had scrubbed floors and raised children and held the hands of the dying, and she did not believe in the gentle persuasion that other servants employed with their employers. She had walked into the drawing room that same afternoon and placed a railway timetable on the table beside Eleanor's teacup. "There is a steamer from Ardrossan every afternoon at 3 o'clock, Mrs. McBride had said, as though announcing the weather. "The fare to Brodick is 4 shillings and 6 pence. I have taken the liberty of packing your sketching things, and I have written to Mrs. Kilbride at the boarding-house to expect you by supper time. You will go to the island, Miss Underwood, and you will stay until you remember what it is to breathe salt air again." Eleanor had opened her mouth to protest, but Mrs. McBride had already turned and was walking towards the kitchen, her footsteps decisive on the polished floorboards. The protest had died in Eleanor's throat, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar sensation that she recognized, after a moment, as relief. So here she was, standing on the platform at Glasgow Central Station, with a single carpet bag at her feet, wearing a grey travelling dress that had seen better days, and a hat that she had trimmed herself with a piece of ribbon that did not quite match. The porters were calling the train for Ardrossan, and the steam was rising from the locomotive in thick white clouds that caught the light filtering through the soot-stained glass roof of the station. She could smell coal smoke and engine oil, and the faint sweet tang of the oranges that a vendor was selling from a wicker basket near the ticket barrier. She picked up her bag and walked towards the train. Eleanor Underwood had been a botanical illustrator for 19 years, since the spring of 1890, when she had presented a portfolio of her watercolors to the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh and been offered a commission that had changed the course of her life. She worked 6 days a week, from 9 in the morning until dusk in summer, and by gaslight until 8 in winter, producing illustrations for botanical journals, scholarly monographs, and the occasional private commission from wealthy gardeners who wished to preserve the beauty of their rose gardens in pigment and paper. Her studio was a small room at the back of her flat, with a north-facing window that let in the steady, cool light that illustrators prized above all things. The room smelled of gum arabic and cold tea, and the particular mustiness of dried plant specimens that had been pressed between sheets of blotting paper for months or years. She kept her brushes in a ceramic jar that had belonged to her father, arranged according to size from the finest sable-pointed brush, used for the delicate veins of leaves and the tiny stamens of flowers, to the broad wash brush she employed for the backgrounds of her more elaborate compositions. The work required a patience that came naturally to her. She could spend an entire morning rendering the curve of a single petal, mixing and remixing her pigments until the color matched the living specimen that sat in a glass of water on her desk. She knew that the light changed the appearance of colors throughout the day, that a petal that appeared white at noon might reveal a faint blush of pink in the late afternoon, that the veins of a leaf were never the same shade from base to tip. She knew these things the way a sailor knows the moods of the sea, without having to think about them, as part of the fabric of her being. And she knew, too, that her skill lay not in inventing beauty, but in observing it. She was a woman who saw things. She noticed the way light fell across a surface, the precise shade of green that moss became after rain, the subtle difference between the bark of a young birch and that of an old one. She had trained her eye over 2 decades to see the world as it was, in all its particular, unglamorous detail, and she had trained her hand to record what her eye saw with a fidelity that had earned her the respect of botanists who were not easily impressed by the work of illustrators. But she had never trained herself to sleep. The wound that kept her awake was a precise one, and it had a name. It was called Thomas, and he had been her husband for 3 years and 4 months before the influenza took him in the winter of 1906. He had been a map maker, a man who spent his days drawing coastlines and contour lines and the delicate curves of river systems. He had understood her work because his own required the same combination of patience and precision, the same willingness to see the world as a series of careful, repeatable marks on paper. They had worked in the same room sometimes, he at his drafting table and she at hers, the only sounds the scratch of pens and the soft turning of pages, and she had been happy in a way that she had not known she was capable of being happy. The night he died, she had been sitting beside his bed in the small hospital on the Royal Mile, holding his hand while his breathing grew shallower and more labored. The nurse had brought a lamp and placed it on the bedside table, and the light had fallen across Thomas's face in a way that Eleanor had noticed even in her grief. The hollows under his cheekbones, the stillness of his eyelids, the faint blue tint that was creeping into his lips. She had memorized his face as though she were about to draw it, noting every shadow and every line, and when he had stopped breathing at exactly 4 minutes past 3 in the morning, she had closed his eyes with her own fingers and had felt something inside her close too. She had not slept through a single night since. The doctors had called it neurasthenia. Her married friends had called it a broken heart and had assured her that time would heal it. Mrs. McBride had called it nonsense and had suggested that what Miss Underwood needed was a good long walk in the fresh air and a proper meal at regular hours. But none of them had been able to explain why her body refused to surrender to sleep, why her mind insisted on replaying the final hours of Thomas's life in vivid, exhausting detail, why she lay awake every night, watching the clock hands move and feeling the hours pass like a slow procession of mourners. She had learned to function on 4 hours of sleep a night, sometimes less. She had learned to hide the shadows under her eyes with a careful application of rice powder. She had learned to answer the polite inquiries about her health with a smile and a change of subject. She had learned to live in a world that was perpetually slightly out of focus, as though she were viewing it through a pane of frosted glass. And now, as the train pulled out of Glasgow Central and began its journey towards the coast, she felt the familiar weariness settle over her like a heavy coat. She had a compartment to herself, a fortunate circumstance that she attributed to the unfashionable hour of the departure, and the fact that most sensible travelers preferred the morning trains. The compartment was upholstered in a faded green velvet that smelled of coal dust and lavender, and the window was streaked with the grime of 1,000 journeys. She placed her carpet bag on the seat beside her, and her sketchbook on her lap, and she watched the city of Glasgow slide past the window in a blur of grey stone and wet slate roofs. She did not open the sketchbook. She did not draw. She simply watched and let the motion of the train carry her forward, away from the flat with its ticking clock and its restless silences, towards the sea. The train reached Ardrossan at 2:15, and Eleanor stepped onto the platform into air that tasted different. The smoke and grit of Glasgow had been replaced by something sharper, cleaner, a breath of salt and seaweed, and the distant iodine of the open sea. She paused for a moment, her carpet bag in her hand, and let the air fill her lungs. And it was colder here, and windier, and the gulls that wheeled above the station roof were calling to one another, in voices that sounded like laughter and complaint mixed together. She had not been to Ardrossan in 20 years. The station looked smaller than she remembered, the platform shorter, the waiting room less grand. But the smell was the same, and the sound of the gulls was the same, and when she walked through the station entrance and saw the grey expanse of the Firth of Clyde stretching out beyond the harbour wall, she felt something shift in her chest, a small, tentative movement, like a key turning in a lock that had not been used for a very long time. The Glen Sannox was waiting at the pier. She was a fine steamer, painted white and black, with a single funnel that was already releasing a thin plume of smoke into the grey sky. Eleanor stood at the foot of the gangplank and watched the passengers boarding. A family with 3 children and a large wicker hamper, a clergyman in a black suit and a high collar, a young woman carrying a parasol and a book, a group of fishermen in heavy coats and boots. She watched them all with the attention of a woman whose profession had taught her to see details that others missed. The way the clergyman's collar was slightly askew, the way the young woman's parasol had a repaired tear in the fabric, the way one of the fishermen had a tattoo on the back of his left hand, a small anchor done in faded blue ink. She paid her fare at the ticket office, 4 shillings and 6pence, just as Mrs. McBride had said, and walked up the gangplank with a steadiness that she did not feel. The deck of the steamer was wet with spray, and the wood had been polished by the footsteps of 1,000 passengers until it gleamed like dark honey. She found a place near the railing on the starboard side, where she could watch the mainland recede and the island approach, and she set her carpet bag down at her feet. The departure was unhurried. A whistle blew, a bell rang somewhere below decks, and the ropes were cast off from the pier with a splash that sent ripples across the gray water. The engine began to throb beneath her feet, a deep and regular pulse that she could feel in the soles of her shoes and the palms of her hands where they rested on the railing. The steamer turned slowly, majestically, pointing her bow towards the open water, and the pier began to slide away. Eleanor watched the town of Ardrossan shrink behind her, the houses and churches and warehouses diminishing until they were no more than a line of gray shapes against the hills. The day was overcast, the sky a uniform white that promised neither rain nor sunshine, and the water was the color of pewter, flecked with white where the wind caught the surface. She could see other vessels in the distance, a fishing boat with a patched sail, a cargo steamer low in the water, a small yacht that seemed to be making for the island of Arran with a determination that she admired. She took her sketchbook from her bag and opened it to a blank page. The paper was thick and creamy, with a texture that caught the graphite of her pencil in a way that she found deeply satisfying. She did not begin to draw immediately. Instead, she held her pencil over the paper and watched the shapes of the land and the sea and the sky, waiting for the moment when something would ask to be drawn. She had learned, over the years, that the best drawings came not from forcing the hand to move, but from allowing the eye to find what it wanted to see. She had learned to wait, to watch, to let the world reveal itself in its own time. It was a lesson that had served her well in her work, and she sometimes wondered if it might serve her equally well in the rest of her life, if she might learn to wait for sleep the way she waited for a drawing to emerge, without effort, without struggle, without the desperate grasping that only drove the thing further away. The pencil moved. She began to sketch the outline of a distant island, a low shape on the horizon that she knew was the Isle of Arran, though she could not yet see its details. The line was light, barely touching the paper, a suggestion rather than a statement. She would fill in the details later, when the island was closer and the light had changed. For now, it was enough to make the mark, to begin the process of recording what she saw. The crossing to Brodick took just over an hour, and Eleanor spent most of it on the starboard deck, her sketchbook open on the railing, her pencil moving in short, deliberate strokes. She drew the wake of the steamer, the white foam trailing behind them like a ribbon that would not hold its shape. She drew the gulls that followed the boat, their wings held at angles that seemed impossible, their bodies buoyant on the air. She drew the clouds, the way they gathered and dispersed and gathered again, the way the light filtered through them in shafts that fell upon the water like the beams of distant lamps. And she drew the island as it grew larger and more defined. The mountains of Arran rose from the sea like the backs of sleeping animals, their flanks covered in heather and bracken that had already begun to turn brown with the approach of autumn. She could see the village of Brodick now, a cluster of white buildings huddled around the bay, and the castle on the hill above it, its gray stone walls softened by the distance. She remembered the castle from her childhood, remembered the way she had imagined knights and princesses and dragons in its towers, remembered the way her father had laughed when she had asked if they might live there one day. The Glen Sannock slowed as she approached the pier at Brodick, and the engine note dropped to a low, rumbling murmur. The deckhands appeared with ropes and fenders, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had performed this same routine 1,000 times before. Eleanor closed her sketchbook and tucked her pencil into the spiral binding, feeling the familiar reluctance that always came when she had to stop drawing. There was something about the act of sketching that quieted her mind, that focused her attention so completely that the rest of the world, including the grief that had kept her awake for so many nights, seemed to recede into a distant background murmur. She gathered her carpet bag and made her way to the gangplank, waiting her turn among the other passengers. The family with the wicker hamper went first, the children chattering with excitement. the mother calling out warnings about wet feet and slippery boards. The clergyman followed, his collar now properly adjusted, carrying a small leather case that he held close to his chest, as though it contained something precious. The young woman with the parasol hesitated at the top of the gangplank, looking back towards the mainland with an expression that Eleanor could not quite read. And then it was her turn. She stepped onto the wooden planks of the pier, feeling the solid ground beneath her feet after the gentle motion of the steamer, and she took a breath that tasted of salt and seaweed and wet stone. The air was different here, cleaner, sharper, filled with the sounds of gulls and lapping water and the distant barking of a dog. She could hear the crunch of her own footsteps on the gravel, the creak of the pier timbers, the soft exhalation of her own breath. She was here. She had arrived. And for the first time in 311 nights, she felt something that might have been the beginning of peace. The boarding house was called Craiglia, and it stood on a quiet street above the harbor, a 2-story building of whitewashed stone, with a roof of gray slate and a front garden that was a riot of late summer flowers. Mrs. Kilbride, the proprietress, was a woman of 60, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen everything and judged nothing. She greeted Eleanor at the door with a firm handshake and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Miss Underwood," she said, "your housekeeper's letter arrived yesterday. I have prepared the front room for you, the one with the view of the sea. I hope you will find it comfortable." Eleanor followed her up a narrow staircase, past walls hung with prints of Highland scenes and photographs of stern-faced ancestors, and into a room that made her stop in the doorway. The window faced directly onto the Firth, and through it she could see the gray water and the distant hills of the mainland, softened by the afternoon light. The room was simply furnished: a bed, a wardrobe, a small writing desk, a chair by the window, but it was clean and quiet, and smelled of lavender and beeswax. She set her carpet bag on the bed and walked to the window. The glass was cool against her fingertips, and the view was exactly as she had remembered it from her childhood holidays. The same curve of the bay, the same line of the mountains, the same light on the water that seemed to change every moment, never quite settling into a single shade. Mrs. Kilbride lingered in the doorway. "Tea will be served at 4:30 in the dining room," she said, "and dinner at 7. Is there anything you need before then?" Eleanor shook her head. "No," she said. "Thank you. I think I will just sit here for a while and look at the sea." Mrs. Kilbride nodded and closed the door, leaving Eleanor alone in the quiet room. She pulled the chair closer to the window and sat down, her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the tide go out. The first morning on Arran began with a light that Eleanor had almost forgotten existed. It was not the thin, gray light of Edinburgh, filtered through layers of coal smoke and tenement shadows. It was a clear, golden light that poured through the window like honey, illuminating every grain of the wooden floor, every thread of the curtains, every particle of dust that floated in the air. She had slept, not deeply, not for more than a few hours at a time, but enough to feel a faint, unfamiliar sense of restoration. The clock on the mantelpiece had not struck 3 in the morning because there was no clock on the mantelpiece, and the silence of the room had been deep and complete. She dressed in her walking clothes, a tweed skirt, a stout pair of boots, a woolen cardigan that had belonged to her mother, and she packed her sketchbook and her tin of watercolor pencils into a canvas satchel. She ate breakfast in the dining room, a simple meal of porridge and toast and tea, while Mrs. Kilbride moved about the room, refilling cups and offering advice about the best walks on the island. "If you go north," Mrs. Kilbride said, "you will come to a village called Corrie. It is a small place, but the walk along the shore is very fine. There is a path that follows the coast, and if you go far enough, you will reach the foot of Glen Sannox. The mountain called Goatfell will be on your left. You cannot miss it." Eleanor thanked her and set out, the satchel slung over her shoulder, her boots crunching on the gravel path that led away from the boarding house. The road to Corrie followed the coast, winding between the sea on one side and the rising slopes of the hills on the other. The tide was out, and the shore was exposed, a wide stretch of gray sand and dark rocks covered in bladderwrack and barnacles. She could smell the exposed seaweed, a sharp, organic smell that was not entirely unpleasant, and she could hear the distant sound of waves breaking on a farther shore. She walked slowly, stopping frequently to examine the plants that grew in the crevices of the dry stone walls that lined the road. There was sea campion, with its small white flowers and its fleshy leaves. There was thrift, growing in dense cushions of pink and green. There was a patch of golden samphire, its yellow flowers bright against the gray stone. She knelt to examine it more closely, her fingers tracing the shape of a leaf, her mind already composing the strokes she would use to render it on paper. A curlew called from somewhere inland, a long, liquid note that rose and fell and rose again. She looked up and saw its silhouette against the sky, the curved bill, unmistakable, the wings held in a V as it flew towards the hills. She watched it until it disappeared behind a ridge, and then she continued walking, her pace slower now, more deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. The village of Corrie appeared around a bend in the road, a cluster of whitewashed cottages gathered around a small harbor. There was a pier of gray stone, and a few fishing boats bobbing at anchor, and a post office that also seemed to sell groceries and newspapers and sweets. She walked through the village, past a garden where a woman was hanging laundry on a line, past a bench where an old man sat smoking a pipe and watching the sea with the patient attention of someone who had watched it for 60 years. She found the coastal path beyond the village, a narrow track that climbed and fell along the contours of the land. It was rougher here, less traveled, and the vegetation changed as she walked, the grass giving way to heather and bracken, the occasional rowan tree bent by the wind into shapes that looked like gestures. The path was damp underfoot, and she had to watch her step, but the rhythm of walking, the steady repetition of footfall and breath, was soothing in a way that surprised her. She came to a place where the path opened onto a small beach, a crescent of pale sand sheltered by cliffs of red sandstone. The water here was clear and green, the color of sea glass, and the waves broke in lines of white foam that advanced and retreated with a regularity that was almost hypnotic. She sat down on a flat rock, her back against a warm stone, and she opened her sketchbook. She drew the curve of the beach, the line of the cliffs, the distant shape of a boat on the horizon. She mixed a wash of blue-gray for the sea and a pale green for the water near the shore. She added a touch of ochre for the sand and a darker gray for the shadows in the cliffs. The brush moved across the paper in strokes that felt as natural as breathing, and for a long time there was no sound but the waves and the gulls and the soft scratch of the brush against the paper. On the second afternoon, Eleanor decided to walk inland, following the course of a stream that flowed down from the hills towards the sea. She had seen the valley from a distance, a deep cleft in the mountains that seemed to invite exploration, and she had felt a pull towards it, a curiosity about what lay beyond the first ridge. The path was steep in places, climbing over rocks and through patches of bracken that reached her waist. The stream ran beside her, a constant companion, its voice a murmur that rose and fell with the gradient. The water was clear and cold, and she could see the stones at the bottom, their colors bright and distinct, as though they had been freshly painted. She stopped to drink from a pool where the water pooled in a basin of dark rock, and the coldness of it made her gasp, a sharp and bracing sensation that cleared her thoughts. She was alone in the glen. There was no sign of any other walker. no distant voices, no footprints in the mud, except her own. The silence was profound, broken only by the stream and the wind and the occasional call of a bird she could not identify. She walked deeper into the valley, and the hills rose on either side, their slopes covered in heather that was just beginning to fade from purple to brown. The air was cooler here, and the light was different, filtered through the clouds that hung over the mountain peaks. The mountain called Goatfell rose to her left, its summit visible through gaps in the cloud. She had climbed it once, as a child, with her father. They had set out early in the morning, carrying a picnic of sandwiches and apples and a bottle of lemonade, and they had reached the top by midday. She remembered the view from the summit, the way the island had spread out below them like a map, the sea glittering in the sunlight, the mainland a distant smudge on the horizon. She remembered her father pointing out the different landmarks, naming the islands, Arran, Butte, the Cumbres, Jura, Isle, and she remembered the feeling of being small and safe and utterly at peace. She had not climbed a mountain since his death. She had not climbed a mountain since she had become a woman who stayed indoors and worked at a desk and watched the clock hands move through the small hours of the night. The thought of attempting Goatfell now, with her tired limbs and her strained eyes and her restless mind, seemed absurd. But the path led upwards, and she followed it. After an hour or more, she came to a place where the stream widened into a pool, deep and dark and still. The water reflected the sky and the surrounding hills, creating a mirror that was almost perfect, broken only by the occasional ripple where a fish rose to the surface. She sat down on a rock beside the pool and took out her sketchbook. She drew the pool first, the dark water and the reflections, the way the light played across the surface. She drew the hills beyond, their shapes softened by the distance, their colors muted by the mist that was beginning to gather in the upper reaches of the glen. She drew a rowan tree that grew from a crevice in the rock, its branches heavy with red berries, its leaves already turning gold. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear the footsteps until they were almost upon her. A shadow fell across the page, and she looked up, startled, to find a man standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression that was difficult to read. He was old. That was the first thing she noticed. His hair was white, and his face was lined with the deep creases that came from a lifetime spent outdoors. He wore a tweed jacket that had been patched in several places, and his boots were worn and stained with mud. In his hand, he carried a walking stick of twisted hazelwood, and on his shoulder, he carried a canvas bag that looked as old and worn as he did. "I hope I have not disturbed you," he said. His voice was low and calm, with the accent of the islands, a soft lilt that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of the waves. "I saw you from the path above, and I thought I would come down to see what you were drawing." Eleanor closed her sketchbook and stood up. "You have not disturbed me," she said. "I was just making some sketches of the glen. It is a beautiful place." The old man nodded. "It is," he said. "I have lived in this glen for 70 years, and I have never grown tired of looking at it." He gestured with his walking stick towards the pool. "The water is clear today. Sometimes it is dark when the rain has been heavy, but today it is clear. You have chosen a good day to draw it." Eleanor smiled. "I hope to capture something of its stillness," she said. "The way the light falls on the water, the reflections." The old man looked at her for a long moment, his eyes pale and steady. "You are a painter," he said. "I can tell by the way you look at things. You see the light, you see the shapes. Most people see the water and the hills, but they do not see the light or the way it changes the shapes. You see those things." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "I am a botanical illustrator, mostly, but I like to draw landscapes too, when I have the chance." The old man nodded again. "I knew a botanical illustrator once," he he said. "A woman who came to the island many years ago. She drew the flowers of Arran, every one of them, from the mountain saxifrage to the sea thrift. She spent a whole summer here, walking the hills and the shores, filling her sketchbooks with drawings. I was a young man then, and I sometimes carried her bags and showed her the paths that only the locals knew. She was a good woman, patient, quiet. She saw things that others did not see." Eleanor felt a strange flutter in her chest. "What happened to her?" she asked. The old man looked out across the pool, his eyes distant. "She finished her drawings and went back to the city," he said. "I never saw her again, but I remembered her. I remembered the way she looked at the world, as though she had all the time in the world to see it. That is a rare gift, to look at the world that way." He turned back to Eleanor, and his expression softened. "You have that gift too," he said. "I can see it in the way you hold your pencil. I can see it in the way you sit so still, watching the light change. It is a gift that will serve you well, if you let it." He raised his walking stick in a gesture that might have been a farewell. "Walk well," he said, "and may the glen give you what you need." And then he turned and walked away, his footsteps steady on the path, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared around a bend in the valley, leaving Eleanor alone by the pool with her sketchbook and her pencil, and a strange, quiet feeling that she could not quite name. Eleanor returned to the boarding house in the late afternoon, her limbs aching from the climb, and her mind full of the colors and shapes she had seen in the glen. She ate dinner alone in the dining room, a simple meal of fish and potatoes, and she retired to her room early, the exhaustion of the day pulling at her like a tide. But sleep, when it came, was not the deep, restorative rest she had hoped for. She lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind in the chimney, the distant bark of a fox, the steady rhythm of the waves on the shore. Her mind would not be still. It replayed the conversation with the old man, his words about the botanical illustrator who had come to the island so many years ago. It replayed the image of the pool, the reflections, the way the light had changed as the afternoon had deepened. It replayed the feeling of being alone in the glen, the silence so deep that she could hear her own heartbeat. She must have slept eventually, because she woke to the light of a gray dawn filtering through the curtains. She lay in bed for a long time, watching the shadows on the ceiling, feeling the weight of the day ahead like a stone in her chest. She wanted to stay in bed, to pull the covers over her head and hide from the world. But the habit of routine was stronger than the desire for rest, and she rose, dressed, and made her way downstairs. The dining room was empty. A plate of toast and a pot of tea sat waiting for her on the table, and a note beside them in Mrs. Kilbride's neat handwriting. "There is a man waiting for you in the garden. He says he has something to show you. It is the same man you met in the glen yesterday. I told him you would be down by 9 o'clock. Eleanor ate her toast slowly, considering the note. The old man, why would he come looking for her? What could he possibly want to show her? She had only spoken to him for a few minutes, and yet he had sought her out, had found her boarding house, had waited for her in the garden. She finished her tea and walked to the back door that led into the garden. The garden was small, enclosed by a stone wall, with a patch of grass and a bench overlooking the sea. The old man was sitting on the bench, his walking stick across his knees, his canvas bag at his feet. He looked up as she approached, and he smiled. "Good morning, Miss Underwood," he said. "I hope you do not mind me calling on you so early. But there is something I think you should see, and it is best seen in the morning light." Eleanor sat down on the bench beside him. "What is it?" she asked. The old man did not answer directly. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a small leather-bound book, worn and faded, its spine cracked with age. He held it out to her, and she took it, her fingers brushing against the worn leather. "Open it," he said. She opened the book. It was a sketchbook, filled with drawings, page after page of delicate, precise illustrations of the plants and flowers of Arran. There was sea thrift and mountain saxifrage, heather and bog myrtle, tormentil and eyebright. Each drawing was labeled in a careful hand, the Latin names and the common names and the dates on which the specimens had been collected. This was hers, the old man said. The botanical illustrator I told you about. She left it behind when she went back to the city. I found it on the path a few days after she had sailed. I meant to send it to her, but I never did. I kept it all these years because it reminded me of the way she looked at the world. Eleanor turned the pages slowly, her heart beating fast. The drawings were beautiful, precise, full of the love and attention that only a true observer could bring. She could see the care in every line, the patience in every shading, the devotion in every careful stroke. "Why are you showing this to me?" she asked. The old man looked at her, his eyes steady. "Because I think you have lost something," he said. "I think you have lost the way you used to look at the world, and I think this might help you remember." He stood up, his joints creaking. "Keep it," he said, "for as long as you are on the island. Look at it when you cannot sleep. Let it remind you of what it means to see." And before Eleanor could thank him, before she could even find the words, he had turned and was walking away, his footsteps steady on the gravel path, his figure disappearing through the garden gate and into the morning light. Eleanor sat on the bench for a long time after the old man had gone, the leather-bound sketchbook open on her lap, the pages fluttering gently in the breeze from the sea. She turned each leaf with the careful reverence one might reserve for a sacred text, her eyes tracing the fine lines of the drawings, the delicate shading that gave each flower a sense of depth and life. The first drawing was of sea thrift, the pink blossoms clustered like small buttons on their slender stems, the leaves fine and grass-like. The label beneath read, Armeria maritima. And beneath that, in a smaller hand, collected 14 June 1887, the shore below the King's Caves. The date was so precise, so specific, that Eleanor felt a small shiver run through her. This woman had noted the exact day, the exact location, as though each specimen were a moment in time that deserved to be remembered. She turned the page. Here was mountain saxifrage, and Saxifraga oppositifolia, its purple flowers pressed against the rock in the drawing, the cracks in the stone rendered with such care that she could almost feel the texture beneath her fingers. Collected 22 June 1887, the summit of Goatfell. The summit of Goatfell, the highest point on the island, a climb of nearly 3,000 feet, and this woman had made it, alone, with her sketchbook and her pencils and her patient, observing eye. Another page, bog myrtle, myrica gale, the leaves detailed with tiny veins, the catkins hanging in clusters. Collected 3 July 1887, the marsh at the head of Glen Rosa, and then heather, Calluna vulgaris, the bell-shaped flowers drawn from 3 different angles, the shading so subtle that the petals seemed to glow against the paper. Collected 11 July 1887, the slopes of Bain Nuys. Eleanor turned page after page, each drawing more beautiful than the last. There was tormentil with its 4 yellow petals, eyebright with its white and purple veined flowers, butterwort with its sticky leaves and solitary violet bloom. There was the delicate harebell, the sturdy foxglove, the humble self-heal. There was even a drawing of the parasitic toothwort, its pale, scaly stem rising from the forest floor, a plant she had never seen, but could now picture with perfect clarity. But it was not just the drawings that held her attention. It was the notes. The woman had written observations in the margins, in a hand that was small and precise, the letters leaning slightly to the right. The thrift grows in dense cushions on the cliff face, the salt spray keeping it low and compact. The saxifrage prefers the north-facing rocks, where the snow lies late into the spring. The bog myrtle releases its scent only when the leaves are bruised, a sharp, resinous fragrance that carries on the wind. Eleanor read these notes with a growing sense of wonder. This woman had not merely drawn the plants. She had understood them. She had watched them, studied them, learned their habits and their preferences, their secret lives in the cracks of the rocks and the damp hollows of the moors. She had given them her full attention, her full presence, and in return, they had revealed themselves to her. Eleanor closed the sketchbook and held it against her chest, feeling the worn leather warm against her hands. She thought of her own work, the careful, precise drawings she made for the Curtis's botanical magazine. The way she had trained herself to see the details, the veins and the petals and the stamens, the subtle variations in color that distinguished one species from another. She had always been proud of her accuracy, her ability to render a plant with scientific precision. But looking at these drawings, she realized that there was something more. There was love. There was a kind of tenderness in the way the pencil had moved across the paper, a patience that went beyond mere observation. She thought of the old man's words. "I think you have lost the way you used to look at the world." And she knew, with a sudden, quiet certainty, that he was right. She had lost something. She had lost the wonder, the joy, the sense of discovery that had first drawn her to botany, to the endless, intricate beauty of the natural world. She had become efficient, competent, professional, but she had stopped seeing. She looked out at the sea, the gray water stretching to the horizon, the light shifting with the clouds. The gulls were crying, their voices sharp and wild, and the wind was carrying the smell of salt and seaweed up from the shore. She sat there for a long time, the sketchbook in her hands, the waves breaking below, and she felt something stir in her chest, something that had been dormant for so long that she had almost forgotten it was there. It was not happiness. It was not peace. It was something quieter, more tentative. A possibility, a small, flickering hope that perhaps, in this place, among these hills and glens and shores, she might find her way back to the thing she had lost. She rose from the bench and walked back into the boarding house, the sketchbook tucked under her arm. Mrs. Kilbride was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she washed the breakfast dishes, and Eleanor paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment. "Mrs. Kilbride," she said, "do you know the old man who came to see me this morning?" Mrs. Kilbride turned, drying her hands on her apron. "Old Hamish," she said. "Hamish McBride. He has lived in the glen for as long as anyone can remember. He knows the island better than any man alive, they say. He knows the paths and the passes, the places where the eagles nest and the deer come down to drink. He is a strange one, but harmless." "Why do you ask?" "He gave me something," Eleanor said. "A sketchbook. It belonged to a woman who came to the island many years ago, a botanical illustrator. He said he found it on the path after she had left." Mrs. Kilbride nodded slowly. "I remember her," she said. "She stayed here, in this very house, a quiet woman with red hair. She was here for the whole summer of 1887. She used to go out every morning with her sketchbook and her bag, and she would not come back until the light was gone. I used to worry about her, out there alone on the hills. But she always came back safe. She always had a smile for me and a story about what she had seen." Eleanor felt a strange connection to this woman, this stranger who had walked the same paths, slept in the same room, looked at the same flowers with the same patient, observing eye. "And what was her name?" she asked. Mrs. Kilbride thought for a moment. "I do not recall," she said. "It has been so long. But I remember she was kind, and she was always drawing, always." Eleanor thanked her and went up to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed, the sketchbook open on her lap, and she began to turn the pages again, more slowly this time, letting each image sink into her mind. She studied the way the woman had drawn the leaves, the way she had captured the curve of a petal, the way she had used the white of the paper to suggest the light falling on a stem. It was a masterclass in seeing, and Eleanor felt herself learning, absorbing, remembering. The afternoon light began to fade, and the room grew dim. Eleanor did not light the lamp. She sat in the gathering dusk, the sketchbook open on her lap, and she let the drawings speak to her in their silent, patient language. And for the first time in many months, she felt a small, quiet stirring of something that might, in time, become peace. The next morning, Eleanor woke before dawn. The light was still gray and uncertain. The world outside her window, wrapped in a thin mist that softened the edges of the hills and the sea. She dressed quickly, pulled on her boots, and took her sketchbook and her pencils from the drawer. She had decided to follow the path of the woman in the sketchbook, to visit the places she had drawn, to see with her own eyes what the other woman had seen. The first location was the shore below the King's Caves. She had read about the caves in the guidebook, a series of large caverns on the south coast of the island, carved by the sea into the sandstone cliffs. They were said to have been used by Robert the Bruce, and later by smugglers and fugitives, but Eleanor was not interested in their history. She was interested in the sea thrift that grew on the cliffs above them, the pink blossoms that the woman had drawn with such care. She walked down the lane from the boarding house, past the small cluster of cottages that made up the village, and onto the road that followed the coast. The mist was beginning to lift, the sun burning through the haze in a pale, watery glow. The sea was calm, a flat, silvery gray, and the air was cool and clean, carrying the smell of damp earth and salt. The road wound along the edge of the cliffs, the land dropping away steeply to the shore below. Eleanor could hear the waves, a soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing. She walked for about a mile, past fields of sheep and dry stone walls, until she came to a sign that pointed down a narrow path towards the caves. The path was steep and rocky, winding down through a stand of gorse and bracken. The gorse was in flower, the yellow blossoms bright against the green, and the air was filled with the scent of coconut, the strange, sweet fragrance that the gorse released in the warmth of the sun. Eleanor picked her way carefully, her boots slipping on the loose stones, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the rough bark of the occasional hawthorn. The path opened onto a wide, flat shelf of rock at the base of the cliffs. The sea was directly below, lapping against the rock with a gentle, insistent motion. And above her, the cliffs rose in a great curve, the sandstone layered in bands of red and ochre and pale gold, the surface pitted and weathered by centuries of wind and rain. And there, in the cracks and crevices of the rock, grew the sea thrift. The pink blossoms nodded in the breeze, their stems tough and wiry, their leaves fine and dark. Eleanor knelt down on the rock, her knees pressing into the cold stone, and she looked at the thrift with the same careful attention that the woman in the sketchbook had given it. She saw the way the petals were arranged, 5 of them, each one a delicate shade of pink, darker at the tips and paler at the base. She saw the way the stamens emerged from the center, their tips dusted with yellow pollen. She saw the way the leaves grew in a dense cushion, protecting the plant from the salt spray and the wind. She saw the way the light fell on the petals, the way the shadows gathered in the crevices of the rock. She opened her sketchbook and began to draw. At first, her hand was stiff, uncertain. She had not drawn for pleasure in so long. and the pencil felt strange in her fingers. But as she worked, the old habits returned, the muscle memory of years of practice. She measured the proportions with her pencil, her thumb sliding along the shaft to gauge the distance. She sketched the outline of the petals, the curve of the stem, the angle of the leaves. She added the shading, the light and dark, the subtle gradations that gave the drawing depth and life. She worked for a long time, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the mist burning away completely. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing off the cliffs. The waves continued their steady rhythm, the sound of them soothing, hypnotic. And Eleanor drew, losing herself in the act of seeing, in the simple, absorbing task of translating what she saw into lines on paper. When she finally stopped, her hand was aching and her knees were stiff. She looked at the drawing and she felt a small, quiet satisfaction. It was not perfect. It was not as good as the drawings in the old sketchbook, not yet. But it was a start. It was a beginning. She stood up, stretching her back, and walked to the edge of the rock shelf. The sea stretched out before her, a vast, gray plain. The horizon, a soft line, where the water met the sky. She could see the outline of the Mull of Kintyre in the distance, the land, a dark smudge against the pale blue. And she thought of the woman who had stood here, in this same place, on a summer day in 1887, drawing the same flowers, looking at the same sea. She wondered what the woman had been thinking. She wondered if she had been happy, or lonely, or both. She wondered if she had known, as she drew, that her sketchbook would be found by a stranger, that it would be kept for nearly 30 years by an old man in a glen, that it would be given to another woman, another botanical illustrator who was lost and searching for a way home. Eleanor closed her sketchbook and tucked it under her arm. She looked at the sea thrift one more time, the pink blossoms bright against the red sandstone, and she felt a small, quiet gratitude for the simple fact of their existence, for the way they grew in the cracks of the rock, for the way they persisted, year after year, in the face of the salt and the wind and the endless, indifferent sea. Eleanor found Hamish McBride 3 days later, on the path that led up to Glen Rosa. She had been walking the lower slopes, searching for the bog myrtle that the woman had drawn, when she saw him sitting on a rock by the side of the stream, his walking stick across his knees, his eyes fixed on the water. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach, but he looked up and saw her, and he smiled, the same quiet, knowing smile he had given her in the garden. "Miss Underwood," he said, "I thought I might find you here." She sat down on the grass beside him, the damp earth cool through her skirt. "How did you know I would come this way?" He shrugged, a slow, easy gesture. "I did not know," he said, "but I hoped. The bog myrtle is in flower now, and I thought you might want to see it." He was right. The bog myrtle was growing in a dense thicket along the edge of the stream, the leaves dark and glossy, the catkins hanging in clusters of pale gold. The air was filled with the sharp, resinous scent of the leaves, a fragrance that was both sweet and bitter, like the memory of something lost. "I have been looking at the sketchbook," Eleanor said, "the one you gave me. I have been visiting the places she drew, the shore below the King's Caves, the summit of Goatfell, the marsh at the head of the glen." Hamish nodded. "She was a remarkable woman," he said. "I have never met anyone else who saw the world the way she did. She was not just drawing the plants. She was drawing the light, the air, the time of day. She was drawing the feeling of being in a place." Eleanor looked at him, at his weathered face and his steady eyes. "How did you know her?" she asked. "You said you carried her bags, that you showed her the paths. But you were young then. You must have been, what, 16? 17? 17, he said. "I was 17 that summer. My father was a shepherd. and I helped him with the flocks. I knew the hills better than anyone. Even then, I knew where the eagles nested, where the deer came down to drink, where the rare flowers grew, and she needed someone to show her the way. He paused, his eyes drifting to the stream, the water running clear over the stones. She was not like the other visitors, he said. She did not come to the island for the scenery, or the fresh air, or the chance to escape the city. She came because she loved the plants. She loved them the way a mother loves a child, the way a gardener loves the soil. She would kneel in the mud to look at a flower, and she would stay there for hours, watching it, learning it, drawing it. Eleanor listened, her hands resting on her sketchbook. "What was her name?" she asked. Hamish was silent for a long moment. "Margaret," he said. "Margaret Ross. She was from Edinburgh, from a family of academics. Her father was a professor of botany at the university. She had been trained in the scientific method, in the precise observation and classification of plants. But she was also an artist. She had a gift for seeing the beauty in the details, the way the light fell on a petal, the way the shadows gathered in the hollow of a leaf." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, his fingers trembling slightly, and held it out to Eleanor. It was a photograph, faded and sepia-toned, showing a woman in a long skirt and a straw hat, standing on a hillside with a sketchbook in her hands. Her hair was dark, tied back in a loose bun, and her face was serious, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. "That is her," Hamish said. "I took that photograph myself, on the day she finished her drawing of the mountain saxifrage. She was pleased with it. She said it was the best drawing she had ever made." Eleanor studied the photograph, her heart beating fast. This was the woman who had walked the same paths, drawn the same flowers, slept in the same room at the boarding house. This was the woman who had left her sketchbook behind, who had sailed away from the island and never returned. "What happened to her?" Eleanor asked. "Why did she leave the sketchbook behind?" Hamish looked at her, his eyes steady. "She left it behind because she was in a hurry," he said. "She received a telegram the day after she finished the drawing of the saxifrage. Her father was ill, dying. She had to leave at once, on the first boat. She packed her bags in a rush, and she forgot the sketchbook. She left it on the path, near the place where I first met you, by the pool in the glen." He paused, his voice growing softer. "I found it the next day, when I went to look for her. I meant to send it to her, but I did not have her address, and by the time I could find it, she had gone. I kept it, all these years, because I could not bear to throw it away. It was all I had left of her." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. "Did you ever see her again?" Hamish shook his head. "No," he said. "I wrote to her, care of her father's university, but I never received a reply. I heard, years later, that she had married and moved to America. I do not know if she ever thought of this island again, or of the sketchbook she left behind." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes bright with an emotion she could not name. "But I have thought of her," he said. "Every day, for nearly 30 years, I have thought of the way she looked at the world, the way she saw the beauty in the smallest things. And when I saw you, by the pool in the glen, I knew that you were the same kind of person. I knew that you had the same gift. And I knew that the sketchbook was meant for you." Eleanor did not know what to say. She looked at the photograph, at the woman's serious face, and she felt a strange, deep connection, as though Margaret Ross were a friend she had never met, a sister she had never known. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for trusting me with it." Hamish smiled, a slow, gentle smile. "It is not a gift," he said. "It is a responsibility. To see the world the way she saw it, to draw the flowers the way she drew them. That is a gift you must pass on." He stood up, his joints creaking, and he looked out across the glen, the hills rising green and gray in the afternoon light. "The bog myrtle is in flower," he said. "You should draw it before the light fades." And he turned and walked away, his footsteps steady on the path, leaving Eleanor alone by the stream, the photograph in her hands, the scent of the bog myrtle filling the air, the water running clear and cold over the stones. Eleanor did not draw the bog myrtle that afternoon. She sat by the stream for a long time, the photograph of Margaret Ross in her hands, the light shifting slowly around her, the shadows lengthening across the glen. She thought about the woman in the photograph, about the life she had lived, the drawings she had made, the sketchbook she had left behind. She thought about Hamish, about the way he had kept the sketchbook for nearly 30 years, the way he had carried the memory of Margaret Ross with him, the way he had given the sketchbook to her, a stranger, because he had seen something in her that reminded him of the woman he had loved. She thought about her own life, the years of careful, precise work, the drawings she had made for the Curtis's Botanical Magazine, the hours she had spent in the herbarium, the evenings she had lain awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She thought about the grief she carried, the loss of her husband, the way it had hollowed her out, the way it had made her retreat into the safety of routine, the way it had stolen her ability to see the world with wonder. And she thought about the old man's words. "I think you have lost the way you used to look at the world." She closed her eyes, and she felt the weight of the years pressing down on her, the exhaustion, the sadness, the loneliness. She had been carrying it for so long that she had forgotten it was there. She had learned to live with it, to work around it, to pretend it did not exist. But it was there, always, a constant presence, a shadow that followed her everywhere. She opened her eyes and looked at the stream, the water running clear and cold over the stones. She looked at the bog myrtle, the leaves dark and glossy, the catkins hanging in clusters of pale gold. She looked at the hills, the green slopes rising to the gray sky, the clouds gathering on the horizon, and she felt something shift inside her. It was not a dramatic change, not a sudden revelation. It was a quiet, gradual loosening, a softening, a letting go. She had been holding on so tightly to her grief, to her routine, to her fear of the unknown. But here, in this glen, by this stream, with the scent of the bog myrtle in the air, she felt the grip begin to loosen. She did not fight it, she let it happen. She let the tears come, the first tears she had shed in years, the tears she had been holding back for so long. They ran down her cheeks, warm and salty, and she did not wipe them away. She let them fall, let them soak into the collar of her dress, let them carry away some of the weight she had been carrying. She sat there for a long time, crying quietly, the stream running beside her, the birds singing in the trees, the wind moving through the grass. And when the tears finally stopped, she felt lighter, emptier, as though something had been drained out of her, leaving a space that could be filled with something new. She opened her sketchbook and picked up her pencil. She looked at the bog myrtle, really looked at it, the way Margaret Ross had looked at the flowers she drew. She saw the way the leaves grew in pairs along the stem, the way the catkins hung down, the way the light caught the edges of the leaves, the way the shadows gathered in the hollows between the branches. She began to draw. Her hand moved slowly, carefully, but there was a new ease in her strokes, a new freedom. She was not trying to be perfect. She was not trying to capture every detail. She was trying to see, to feel, to let the plant speak to her in its own language. She drew the leaves, the catkins, the stem. She drew the way the light fell on the leaves, the way the shadows gathered beneath them. She drew the way the plant grew out of the damp earth, the way it leaned towards the water, the way it seemed to be reaching for something. And when she finished, she looked at the drawing, and she saw that it was not the best drawing she had ever made. It was not as precise as the drawings she made for the magazine. It was not as detailed as the drawings in Margaret Ross's sketchbook, but it was different. It was alive. It had a quality that she had not achieved in years, a quality that she had almost forgotten she was capable of. She closed her sketchbook and stood up. The light was fading, the sky turning a pale, translucent blue, the first stars appearing in the east. The air was cool, and she could smell the damp earth, the bog myrtle, the distant salt of the sea. She walked back down the path, her steps slow and steady, her mind quiet and still. She did not think about the past. She did not think about the future. She thought only about the present moment, the feel of the ground beneath her feet, the sound of the wind in the grass, the gentle rhythm of her own breathing. And when she reached the boarding house, she did not go straight to her room. She stood in the garden, looking out at the sea, the water dark and still, the sky fading from blue to gray to black. She listened to the waves, the steady, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat, like a lullaby, and she felt, for the first time in years, that she might be able to sleep. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room with a weariness that was not merely physical. It was a deep, bone-tiredness, a fatigue that had been accumulating for years, layer upon layer, like sediment settling at the bottom of a still pool. She undressed slowly, her fingers clumsy with the buttons, and she pulled on her nightgown, the cotton soft and cool against her skin. She did not light the lamp. The room was filled with the soft gray light of the dusk, the shadows gathering in the corners, the shapes of the furniture becoming indistinct. She pulled back the covers and climbed into bed, the mattress yielding beneath her, the pillows cool against her cheek. She lay on her back, her hands resting at her sides, her eyes open, watching the ceiling. The room was quiet, the only sound the distant murmur of the sea, the occasional creak of the old house settling around her. She could hear her own breathing, slow and steady, and she could feel her heartbeat, a gentle, rhythmic pulse in her chest. She did not try to sleep. She did not try to empty her mind. She simply lay there, present, aware, letting the sounds and the sensations wash over her. She felt the weight of the blankets, the coolness of the air on her face, the softness of the pillow beneath her head. She felt the tiredness in her limbs, the heaviness in her eyelids, the slow, gradual relaxation of her muscles. And then, without her willing it, without her even noticing it at first, sleep began to come. It came not as a sudden descent, but as a gradual, gentle tide, rising slowly, filling the spaces between her thoughts, softening the edges of her awareness. She felt it first in her feet, a warmth, a heaviness, as though they were sinking into the mattress. Then it spread to her legs, her hips, her stomach, a slow, spreading warmth, like honey poured into a glass. Her thoughts began to slow, to fragment, to drift apart like clouds dispersing in a gentle wind. She thought of the bog myrtle, the leaves, dark and glossy, the catkins hanging in clusters of pale gold. She thought of the stream, the water running clear and cold over the stones. She thought of Hamish, his weathered face, his steady eyes, the way he had looked at her when he gave her the sketchbook. She thought of Margaret Ross, the woman in the photograph, the woman who had drawn the flowers of Arran with such love and care. She wondered if Margaret had ever found peace, if she had ever been able to sleep the way Eleanor was sleeping now, slowly, gently, without fear, without resistance. The tide rose higher. The warmth spread to her chest, her arms, her shoulders. Her breathing grew deeper, slower, the rhythm of it matching the rhythm of the waves outside her window. The sounds of the house grew distant, muffled, as though they were coming from a great distance. She was aware of the bed, the blankets, the pillow, but they seemed far away, as though she were floating above them, suspended in a warm, dark space. She was aware of her own body, but it felt distant, heavy, as though it belonged to someone else. And then she was not aware of anything at all. Sleep came. It did not ask permission. It did not announce itself. It simply arrived, like the tide, like the night, like the slow, inevitable turning of the earth. It gathered her up, gently, tenderly, and carried her away from the shore of wakefulness, out into the deep, dark water of dreams. She dreamed of the glen, the hills rising green and gray, the stream running clear and cold. She dreamed of the bog myrtle, the leaves dark and glossy, the catkins hanging in clusters of pale gold. She dreamed of Hamish walking ahead of her on the path, his walking stick tapping against the stones, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared around a bend in the valley. She dreamed of Margaret Ross, sitting on a hillside, her sketchbook open on her lap, her pencil moving across the paper. She looked up as Eleanor approached, and she smiled, a warm, gentle smile, and she held out her hand. "Come," she said, "sit with me. There is something I want to show you." Eleanor sat down beside her, and Margaret pointed to a flower growing at their feet. It was a small, delicate flower, with white petals and a yellow center, growing in a crack in the rock. Eleanor had never seen it before, and she leaned closer, studying it, the way the petals were arranged, the way the light fell on them, the way the shadows gathered in the center. "Do you see it?" Margaret asked. Eleanor nodded. "I see it," she said. And she did. She saw it completely, fully, without distraction, without the weight of the past, without the fear of the future. She saw it the way Margaret had seen it, the way she had been learning to see it again, the way she had almost forgotten she could see it. She looked at Margaret, and Margaret smiled, and then she was gone, and Eleanor was alone on the hillside, the flower at her feet, the wind in her hair, the sun warm on her face. And she was not afraid. She was not sad. She was not lonely. She was at peace. The dream faded, and Eleanor sank deeper into the darkness, the warmth, the stillness. The tide had carried her far from the shore now, and there was nothing but the water, the dark, warm water, holding her, cradling her, carrying her into the deep, into the night, into the quiet, endless sleep. The hours passed. The moon rose over the island, a thin crescent of silver light, casting pale shadows across the hills and the glens. The tide turned, the waves retreating from the shore, the water sliding back over the pebbles with a soft, sighing sound. The wind dropped, and the world grew still, the only sound the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the woman in the bed. Eleanor did not stir. She lay in the deep, dark water of sleep, her body still, her mind quiet, her heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm. She was not dreaming now. She was beyond dreams, beyond thoughts, beyond the reach of memory or desire. She was simply present, suspended in the warm, dark space between waking and sleeping, between the past and the future, between the world she had left behind and the world she was slowly, gently, finding her way back to. The house settled around her, the old timbers creaking softly, the chimney sighing, as the last of the day's warmth escaped into the night. The clock in the hallway ticked, a steady, measured sound, marking the passage of time, with a patient, indifferent precision. The mice in the walls rustled, going about their small, secret business, and Eleanor slept, undisturbed, untroubled, at peace. She did not know how long she slept. Time had lost its meaning, its boundaries dissolved in the warm, dark water. She might have slept for hours, or for days, or for a single, endless moment. It did not matter. She was not counting. She was not measuring. She was simply resting, letting her body and her mind repair themselves, letting the accumulated weariness of years drain away, drop by drop, into the depths of the night. At some point, the quality of the darkness changed. The black of the night began to soften, to thin, to turn to a deep, velvety gray. The first light of dawn was gathering somewhere beyond the horizon, a pale, tentative glow, like the first brushstroke of a watercolor on a blank page. Eleanor felt it, even in her sleep. She felt the shift in the light, the change in the air, the subtle stirring of the world as it began to wake. She did not fight it. She did not cling to the last remnants of sleep. She let herself rise, slowly, gently, like a bubble rising through water, breaking the surface into the light. She opened her eyes. The room was filled with a soft, gray light, the light of early morning, the light of a new day. The curtains were pale, and the light filtered through them, casting a gentle, luminous glow on the walls, the furniture, the bed. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of the sea, the damp earth, the faint, sweet fragrance of the gorse. Eleanor lay still, her eyes open, her body warm and heavy with the residue of sleep. She felt different. She could not say exactly how, but she felt different. The weight that had been pressing down on her chest for so long had lifted, or at least lightened. The tightness in her jaw, the tension in her shoulders, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety that had been her companion for years, all of it was gone, or at least quieted, softened, reduced to a whisper. She stretched her arms above her head, her joints popping softly, her muscles protesting the movement. She turned her head and looked at the window, at the pale light, at the sky beyond, which was slowly turning from gray to a soft, translucent blue. She could hear the birds, the gulls, the robins, the blackbirds, their voices rising in a chorus of greeting to the new day. She sat up slowly, the blankets falling away from her shoulders. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cold floor, and she sat there for a moment, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes closed, breathing in the cool, clean air. She felt rested, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, in a way she had not felt in years. She felt as though she had been washed clean, as though the deep, dark water of sleep had carried away the accumulated debris of her grief, her loneliness, her fear. She felt empty, but it was a good emptiness, a receptive emptiness, a space that could be filled with new things, new experiences, new ways of seeing the world. She stood up and walked to the window. She parted the curtains and looked out at the garden, the sea, the hills beyond. The mist was rising from the glen, thin and white, curling around the slopes like a veil. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, a pale, golden disk, casting long, soft shadows across the land. The world was beautiful. It was not a dramatic beauty, not a spectacular beauty. It was a quiet, ordinary beauty, the beauty of a morning on a small island off the coast of Scotland, the beauty of the light on the water, the mist in the glen, the birds singing in the trees. It was the beauty that was always there, waiting to be seen, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be appreciated. And Eleanor saw it. She saw it clearly, fully, without the filter of her grief, without the weight of her past. She saw it the way Margaret Ross had seen it, the way Hamish had seen it, the way she had been learning to see it again, day by day, drawing by drawing, breath by breath. She turned away from the window and began to dress. She pulled on her skirt, her blouse, her boots. She took her sketchbook from the drawer and tucked it under her arm. She picked up her pencils and walked to the door. She had a drawing to make. The bog myrtle was in flower, and the light was perfect, and she had a new way of seeing, a new way of being, a new way of moving through the world, and she was ready. Eleanor walked down the lane from the boarding house, the morning air cool and clean on her face. The sun was climbing higher now, the mist burning away, the hills emerging from the haze in shades of green and gray. The sea was calm, a flat, silvery expanse, the surface barely rippled by the light breeze. She did not walk quickly. She walked slowly, deliberately, her eyes open, her senses alert. She noticed the way the light fell on the leaves of the hawthorn, the way the shadows gathered beneath the hedgerows, the way the dew sparkled on the grass, each droplet a tiny, perfect prism. She noticed the song of the skylark, rising and falling, the distant bleat of a sheep, the soft, rhythmic sound of her own footsteps on the gravel path. She followed the path that led up into the glen, the same path she had walked on her first day on the island, the path that led to the pool where she had met Hamish. But this time, she did not stop at the pool. She continued up the glen, following the stream, past the stands of gorse and bracken, past the outcrops of red sandstone, past the places where the bog myrtle grew in thick, fragrant clusters. She came to a place where the stream widened into a shallow, rocky pool, the water clear and cold, the stones on the bottom smooth and rounded. The bog myrtle grew in abundance here, the leaves dark and glossy, the catkins hanging in clusters of pale gold, the air thick with the sharp, resinous scent. She sat down on a flat rock by the edge of the pool. She opened her sketchbook and picked up her pencil. She looked at the bog myrtle, really looked at it, the way Margaret Ross had looked at the flowers she drew, the way she had been learning to look at the world again. She saw the way the leaves grew in pairs along the stem, the way the catkins hung down, the way the light caught the edges of the leaves, the way the shadows gathered in the hollows between the branches. She saw the way the plant grew out of the damp earth, the way it leaned towards the water, the way it seemed to be reaching for something. She began to draw. Her hand moved slowly, carefully, but there was a new ease in her strokes, a new freedom. She was not trying to be perfect. She was not trying to capture every detail. She was trying to see, to feel, to let the plant speak to her in its own language. She drew the leaves, the catkins, the stem. She drew the way the light fell on the leaves, the way the shadows gathered beneath them. She drew the way the plant grew out of the damp earth, the way it leaned towards the water, the way it seemed to be reaching for something. And as she drew, she felt a quiet, deep contentment settle over her. It was not the excitement of discovery, not the satisfaction of achievement. It was something simpler, quieter, more fundamental. It was the feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She did not know how long she sat there, drawing. The sun climbed higher, the light shifted, the shadows shortened and lengthened, the birds sang, the stream ran, the wind moved through the grass, and Eleanor drew, losing herself in the act of seeing, in the simple, absorbing task of translating what she saw into lines on paper. When she finally stopped, her hand was aching and her knees were stiff. She looked at the drawing and she smiled. It was not the best drawing she had ever made. It was not as precise as the drawings she made for the spins. Curtis's Botanical Magazine. It was not as detailed as the drawings in Margaret Ross's sketchbook, but it was hers. It was the drawing of a woman who had found her way back to the thing she had lost, the thing she had almost forgotten she was capable of. She closed the sketchbook and stood up. She looked at the glen, the hills rising green and gray, the stream running clear and cold, the bog myrtle growing in thick, fragrant clusters. She looked at the light, the way it fell on the water, the way it caught the edges of the leaves, the way it seemed to be painting the world in shades of gold and green and gray. And she thought of Margaret Ross, the woman who had come to this island so many years ago, the woman who had drawn the flowers of Arran with such love and care, the woman who had left her sketchbook behind, the woman who had given her, through the hands of an old man in a glen, a gift that she had not known she needed. She thought of Hamish, his weathered face, his steady eyes, the way he had looked at her when he gave her the sketchbook. She thought of the way he had said, "It is not a gift, it is a responsibility. To see the world the way she saw it, to draw the flowers the way she drew them, that is a gift you must pass on." And she understood, at last, what he had meant. She turned and walked back down the path, her steps slow and steady, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. The sun was warm on her face. The air was sweet with the scent of the gorse and the bog myrtle, and the sea was a vast silver plain, stretching to the horizon. She did not know what the future would bring. She did not know if she would ever return to this island, if she would ever see Hamish again, if she would ever finish the drawings she had started. But she knew, with a quiet, certain knowledge, that she would carry this place with her, in her heart, in her hands, in the way she looked at the world. She walked back to the boarding house, and she did not look back. She did not need to. The glen was with her, the stream, the bog myrtle, the light, the silence. They were part of her now, woven into the fabric of her being, a thread of peace and beauty that would run through the rest of her life. And when she reached the garden, she paused, looking out at the sea, the water dark and still, the sky pale and clear. She thought of the night that had passed, the deep, dark water of sleep that had carried her away from the shore of her grief and brought her, gently, tenderly, to the shore of a new morning. She thought of the drawing she had made, the bog myrtle, the leaves, the catkins, the light. She thought of the way she had seen it, the way she had drawn it, the way she had felt, sitting by the stream, alone in the glen, at peace, and she smiled. The sun continued to climb, the day continued to unfold, and the world continued to turn, indifferent and beautiful, full of small, quiet miracles, waiting to be seen. Eleanor went inside, and she began to pack her things. The boat would leave in the afternoon, and she would return to the city, to her work, to her life. But she would not return the same person. She would return with a new way of seeing, a new way of being, a new way of moving through the world. She would return with the memory of the glen, the stream, the bog myrtle, the light. She would return with the sketchbook of Margaret Ross and the photograph of a woman she had never met, and the words of an old man who had shown her the way back to the thing she had lost. She would return with the gift of seeing, and she would pass it on, in her own way, in her own time, drawing the flowers, the leaves, the light, the shadows, the small, quiet miracles that were always there, waiting to be noticed. And she would sleep, not every night, perhaps, but often enough, deeply enough, peacefully enough. The glen would be with her, always.